Dr. Nuno Ribeiro, welcome back and thank you for joining me again on the Bureau Podcast.
Thank you so much, Matt. It's a pleasure to be back. As always, a big fan of the program, and I'm delighted to be here with you today.
Great. So let's get straight into my questions for you today, and I have a few. Firstly, what did the typical backpacker to Vietnam look like pre-COVID-19?
Okay, well, a little bit of history and a little bit of background. As you know, Vietnam tourism has very recent origins. It started opening up in the early 90s. And in fact, the first Lonely Planet, the famous guidebook edition that includes Vietnam, dates from 1991. Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia Travel Survival Kit by Daniel Robinson and Joe Cummings. And there were not many travel guidebooks aimed at Vietnam until then. And what happens is we have to remember that the backpackers to Vietnam are the direct descendants of the hippies who followed the hippie trails through India, the Middle East, all the way to Southeast Asia. And in the 1990s, the early backpackers, they were very much budget conscious. They were looking for adventure. They were looking to explore places. They were what we call in the tourism literature allocentrics. In other words, they were very keen to go to dangerous, risky places where no one else had gone before. They were looking for this perfect place. And again, they were very budget conscious. Well, fast forward 10 or 20 years or so, and we get to the times where we have pre-COVID, where we have backpackers who are not necessarily backpackers in the traditional sense. They may still have a small backpack, but most of them are now toting Samsonites. They're not necessarily having the big backpack. They're not camping anymore. Are they budget conscious? Yes, a little. But at the same time, they're staying in certain enclaves. So the most common example would be Bưu Vien in Ho Chi Minh City. They would travel to places such as Sapa, Hoi An, Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City. Typically, they would fly. They would not ride the train. They would not ride the bus. They would typically fly into the country. They might acquire a motorbike, and they'll typically do the trek, which starts from the north all the way to the south. Starts in Hanoi, does the Ha Giam Loop, visited a couple of places, and ends in Ho Chi Minh City, and then they would fly back. Why do we call them backpackers in addition to the obvious? The Vietnamese call them Thai Ba Lo, which is a direct transliteration of Westerner with a backpack. But yes, they do carry backpacks. They do carry some of their possessions on their back. But in reality, the profile in recent years is changing. We're looking at younger individuals. Yes, these are individuals younger than 30, anywhere between 21, 22 until 30, 32. That sort of 10 age gap. And they were coming to Vietnam to experience adventure because they'd seen it, because they'd heard about it, they read about it. A very famous movie with Leonardo DiCaprio that put Southeast Asia on the map, The Beach, or they'd been traveling around Southeast Asia, Thailand, Laos, Cambodia. But they do have more disposable income than we typically give them credit to. They do not necessarily speak the language, nor make more than token efforts to do so. They tend to share their travels via blog, other forms of social media, via Instagram, Facebook, whatever the case may be, in real time. They tend to stay in budget accommodations, and they tend to spend time within a small group, what we call the backpackers bubble. Until COVID sort of exploded, we had certain areas in Vietnam that they were magnets for backpackers, namely Ho Chi Minh City, Hoi An, Da Nang, and some areas in Hanoi. All of that obviously has changed with COVID-19. And so we're very expectant to see, what's going to happen. The experience for the typical backpacker, the backpacker would arrive with a sort of bucket list. And where would this bucket list be drawn from? It'd be drawn from, in the late 90s, from guidebooks such as Lonely Planet. In the late 2000s, 2010s, it would be drawn from something they might have seen on social media. They wanted to ride a motorbike in Ha Giam Loop. They wanted to take a cruise in Ha Long Bay. They wanted to see the Old Quarter in Hanoi. They wanted to take certain photographs in certain places. They did not necessarily want to spend that much money, but if the experience was valuable enough, then they would do so. They would typically eat street food with every now and again they would splurge for what we'd call in Vietnam a Western type meal. And typically they would stay anywhere between 1 week to 3 weeks, with some of them ended up staying. They might have found paid employment and extended their stay for a few months or even in some cases years.
So why are backpackers seemingly maligned within the travel industry and in some cases, even among fellow travellers?
This is a terrific question, Matt, and something that we have, as researchers, have been discussing and debating and researching for a long time, more than 10, 20 years. I think there's the obvious stereotype. They are budget conscious. That is true. They tend not to spend too much money. They tend to not necessarily speak the language or make any effort to speak it. And in Vietnam, that's quite difficult. They tend to come from Western countries. They tend to come from privileged backgrounds. They tend to stay within their own bubble. And there's this perception they're not all that interested in the history and culture and the language of a given country that they visit, but they're sort of devourers of experiences, if you will. This is sort of the stereotype, but that's not necessarily correct. And that's been changing. We are seeing far more educated travelers with or without a backpack on their backs arriving in Vietnam, arriving in whatever country they may decide to visit, with a great deal more of knowledge about the country. They're armed with a variety of tools, something like, Duolingo that will allow them to get past, the 5 or 6 words that you might need to get by on a daily basis. But even among fellow travelers, to be called a tourist is sort of an insult. You're not really devoting time to get to know the country, to get to know the people, to get to know its customs and traditions. And that's sort of the stereotype behind backpackers. To be called Thai Bao is not something nice. It's pejorative. It's insulting. And I want to say, I'm not sure if this goes into the next question or not, but I want to say that the stereotype is changing. And in my view, it's changing for the positive.
How are backpackers perceived then in Vietnam across the spectrum? So from street level upwards to governmental level? Overall,
I still think that there is some of this stereotype lingering in the background. I mean, they are not necessarily seen as the most desirable tourists. They're highly unlikely, for example, to stay in 4- and 5-star hotels. They're unlikely to eat, say, Michelin-star restaurants or fine dining restaurants. But really, it depends on whether or not the person who you ask this question, how they're perceived, whether or not they stand to make a financial gain from backpackers. So, for example, if you go to an area that's teeming with hostels and local eateries, they might say that, well, actually, we quite like backpackers. They keep us in business. If you go, say, to the Museum of Fine Arts, they probably haven't seen a backpacker in a while. So it really depends on whether or not there's financial gain to be obtained from the backpackers. At higher levels, though, it's a very interesting question because we're sort of struggling with this question. What do we do with them? Do we want backpackers, yes or no? Because with them, they are more prone to risky behaviors, be it promiscuous sexual behavior, be it drug consumption, and so forth, which are not necessarily desirable in the host country. But at the same time, they do spend money. And in some cases, the length of stay of a backpacker may even exceed that of other types of tourists. They're also very good at detecting what's going to be the next big place, right? There's a reason why they're allocentric. There's a reason why they're explorers. They might be the ones to figure out, like in the case of Vietnam, without backpackers, for example, we wouldn't have a variety of tourism services, say, in Da Nang. We wouldn't have a variety of tourism services in Ha Long Bay. We wouldn't have such a variety of tourism services even in Dalat, because backpackers were sort of the first ones to go there in significant numbers to bring attention to that particular destination. At the government level, that's probably something you want to ask government officials, but I think we're sort of in a quandary, right? Because, and not to get too technical, but when we look at the impact of tourism, specifically when we look at it economically, we look at 3 types: direct, indirect, and induced. Direct impacts are the amount of money that's directly spent by tourists, say when they stay at a hotel, when they eat a meal, when they book a tour with a travel agent, and so forth. Indirect is when elements of the tourism industry, it could be a hotel, it could be a travel agency, it could be a restaurant, whatever the case may be, an airline, whatever the case may be, when they themselves acquire goods and services, say, they buy food, for example, to provide for tourist services. And induced impact is the overall boom in the economy just by the sheer presence of tourists and the overall circulation of money, typically in the form of foreign currency. Now, what backpackers bring, in addition to all of those 3, And in some cases, it can be argued, yes, they do bring economic benefits, but not as much as regular tourists. They bring an additional fourth factor, which I call ancillary impact, which are impacts primarily at the level of marketing and promotion. I'll give you a common example. If you go on YouTube and put Vietnam tourism, the YouTube videos with the most number of hits, which are now in the millions, come from backpackers who visited Vietnam, who blogged and vlogged about Vietnam. They're the ones to promote the image of Vietnam. Now, our question is the image that backpackers promote and share with the rest of the world, is that the same image that we want to promote? That's sort of the question. And it'll be very, very interesting to see. There aren't many backpackers right now, not to mention because the country is on virtual lockdown, but it'll be extremely interesting to see what happens post-COVID-19, which I suspect will be fairly soon, given the rate that things are progressing in a few months or even 6 months. What will the image be that backpackers, at least the ones who stayed, that they will promote to the world, how that will contrast with the image that we want as stakeholders in the Vietnamese tourism industry? What do we want to promote Vietnam as? What type of destination we want it to be?
What would be the case for encouraging backpackers back to Vietnam immediately after travel resumes?
Well, first and foremost, because they are less likely to be daunted by risky situations. And let's not forget that COVID-19 is a risk factor, right? They're likely to want to travel, number one. Number two, they will travel in significant numbers. If Vietnam is one of the early countries to open up to tourism in Asia post-COVID-19, there will be backpackers, be it from North America, South America, Europe, South Korea, Russia, wherever the case may be, willing to travel to Vietnam. And they do have an economic impact. And again, they have what I was just referring to, those ancillary impacts that will help the promotion of Vietnam in the international stage to a great deal.
And conversely, what would be the case against encouraging backpackers back to Vietnam?
We may not want them here, to put it very bluntly. We may not want that image. We may want to give the image that Vietnam is not for backpackers, that we want more upscale type of travelers. We want travelers that are going to manifest an interest in the history and culture of Vietnam. We want travelers that are going to repeat their travels to Vietnam, which does not happen with backpackers, for example. Backpackers see Vietnam very much as a bucket list item. They will come to Vietnam once and very, very rarely will they return. They might stay. They might go to Bangkok in Thailand. They might go to Vientiane in Laos, and they may do another loop through Ho Chi Minh City. But typically, it's a bucket list destination. They will visit once and they will not return. We may not want that. We may also want tourists to stay for lengthier periods of time. We may want tourists to spend more money. We may want tourists who may not be as prone to certain types of risky behaviors. That may be the case.
Backpackers contribute to local communities and economies, as do travellers who fly in, stay at an international 5-star resort for a week, then fly out. Are there any foreseeable impacts, economically or otherwise, if backpackers aren't encouraged to visit Vietnam?
Yes, I think so. Economically, I think we will see a decrease in small travel agents, in domestic travel, both in the case of airlines, trains, and buses. We will see definitely a decrease in specific areas, what we call backpacker enclaves in large cities that have a variety of businesses dependent on them. And of course, we will see a decrease in the overall media attention given to Vietnam.
From a socio-anthropological perspective, what effect might a backpacker travel ban, for want of a better term, to Vietnam have on the development of young individuals from countries like Australia?
Well, I think it will be clear that young travelers from countries like you mentioned, such as Australia or New Zealand, they will not stop traveling. They will simply redirect their travel. Instead of visiting Vietnam, they might visit Laos and Cambodia, for instance. They may skip Vietnam altogether if they still want to visit Southeast Asia. They may redirect their travelers to Japan or South Korea or even southern China, but they will not stop traveling. So I'm not sure if a backpacker travel ban, as in, and then we have to think, how exactly are we going to about enforcing it? I mean, if you have a backpack, you can't travel to Vietnam. And how are we going to do that? Oh, I'm sorry, sir, but your backpack exceeds the maximum limitations. Or you're wearing chacos and you have a beard. No, you can't come in. We have to think about these things and how exactly would we enforce it? I think the de facto ban on backpackers to Vietnam, if it is very stringent, I'm not utterly convinced it would have positive effects.
In terms of the way Vietnam is marketed, including earned media, as a welcoming travel destination, would discouraging backpackers from coming here impact on that in any way?
I think so, because again, to refer to those ancillary impacts, backpackers are crucial in the making and marketing, whether voluntary or involuntary, of Vietnam's travel image in the world scene. And overall, with very, very few exceptions, the image that backpackers portray through their social media is overwhelmingly positive. There's maybe one or two famous exceptions, but typically Vietnam is portrayed as a very open country with very friendly people, very welcoming, filled with natural and man-made beautiful destinations to visit and explore. It has just about everything. It has nature, it has history, it has culture, sport, it has beaches. And it's such a positive image that if we were to discourage backpackers from coming here, we might lose allies or advocates in that positive image that we're trying to portray. Because obviously we want Vietnam to be known as a welcoming destination in the sense that we want more people to come and travel to Vietnam and discover how beautiful it is and how fantastic it is. We want to encourage people to stay longer. We want them to extend their stay. And most importantly, we want to encourage international travelers to Vietnam to repeat their travels to Vietnam. We do not want to be a bucket list item for any traveler, backpacker, or otherwise. We want people to return again and again and again to Vietnam because there's so much to see and so much to discover.
Dr. Nuno Ribeiro, once again, thank you for taking time to answer these questions for me today. No doubt I'll have more for you to answer in the coming weeks. Until then, stay safe.
Stay safe, you too, Matt. Again, it was an absolute pleasure. Take care.